So today with me, I have three writers who I'm really excited to have in this panel. So first of all, we have Yasmin Azad, and then Dr. Neshantha Harischandra, and also Carmel Miranda. Let me we'll start the session with Yasmin. Uh, Yasmin comes from one of the old Gulf Fort Muslim families, if I should say so, of which she weaves the tapestry of her memoir, Stay Daughter. So, Stay Daughter deals with the challenge that confronts conservative Muslim communities, something that we see a lot, especially these days within through generations as well. The the challenge is maintaining traditions of Orthodox Islam while allowing the younger generation, especially the girls, the freedom they need to be part of the modern society. And Yasmin beautifully captures this, focusing on one particular family, but something that actually, transcends that family and even transcends the Gulf Fort. So Yasmin, I would like to invite you first to do your reading, and then we will follow by a few points that come up from there.
Thank you, Tinaz, for that wonderful introduction. So, in addition to the conflict between orthodoxy and freedom, there's an intersection which I choose a passage that I read today will deal with that, is that Westernization and those who are not Westernized. Specifically those who speak English in Sri Lanka, those who don't. Because in some ways the conflict between orthodoxy and freedom has its roots in Westernization and non-Westernized. Because it's those who are Westernized who have to deal more with this conflict. So I'm going to begin. Wapa, my father, had never formally learned English, but eagerly picked it up wherever he could, mostly during his business dealing and in the courts, where he spent quite a bit of time making sure that no one cheated him of anything that was his due, whether it was land, gemstones, or money. He pored over newspapers, repeated what he heard other people say, and tried out conversations with strangers. Most dangerously of all, he sounded out with abandon words he had only encountered in print. And that I learned when I was still very small was not the way to do it. Not when the English language was English. I was about 9 years old and eagerly turning the pages of one of my friend Penny's books. Look, I told her, as I came to a boat. Look at this yachet. Yachet? Penny asked. Yes, look right here. I put my finger on the picture. Penny burst out laughing. That's not a yachet. It's a yacht. The blood rushed to my face and I hurriedly turned the page. I was glad no one else was around, especially no one from the Gaul fort. Else, for the rest of my life, I might have been called Yachat Yasmin, like Danga Hussein Nanua, whose nickname stuck to him till he died. Hapless Hussein Nana was taking a stroll with his friends one afternoon when they came upon a road sign propped up over an open manhole. Look, Hussein Nana had exclaimed as he pointed at the big red letters written across the board. Over there, it says Danga. His friends had howled and hooted. After they had stopped laughing, and according to some, wiped the tears from their eyes, they told him, that's danger. Those of us who did not live in homes where Peter had gone to an English school and scoured Kennedy's Latin primer for the rules of the third declension, did not know from the very beginning that the H in air was silent, like the B in lamb, that heard did not sound anything like beard, and that sweet would actually rhyme with feet. We came from a home where they did not speak even a word of English. My brothers and I, who studied at missionary schools run by Irish nuns and Italian Jesuit priests, fretted that Wapa, every time he opened his mouth, would dismantle our toehold on the exclusive club of the English speaking. He mangled the pronunciation of words, absolved his verbs of any need to agree with his nouns, and plunked a grandly polysyllabic phrase anywhere into his conversation just to let people know he knew it. He had a penchant too for words with barita, dignity, words he mostly picked up from his business and legal dealings, which he thought a shameful waste not to use in everyday life. When he gave a gift, he wanted to know whether the person had acknowledged receipt. When his children did something naughty, he told them they were indulging in a criminal offense. And if they tried to evade responsibility, he countered, but you were aiding and abetting. As much as we could, we kept our English-speaking friends and their families away from our father. But being the gregarious person he was, this wasn't easy. And we had to listen with our mouths going dry to his forays into linguistic territory he had no business approaching. And after he was done, exercise damage control as best as we could. No, 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 Vapa. It's the lunar calendar. Can you remember that, please? You should have told Dr. Pereira that the Muslims follow the lunar calendar, not the lunatic calendar.
Thank you so much, Yasmin. I think that was one of the like really hilarious parts of the book I found as well. But actually, what you're doing there is apart from just showing the conflict in terms of religion and culture in between the Orthodox Muslim community or the traditional Muslim community and the next generation who's like trying to go out into the modern world, you're also bringing in the language aspect into it, which I find is quite common, I assume, for most of the communities. So Yasmin, growing up in this sort of in this background, what are the other things like like you said, like you spoke about language, what are the other things that you experienced in these terms of um, the boundaries, and what are the boundaries that had to be pushed further from the community in order to let the younger generation interact with the modern world?
Somehow the communication is not very clear, but I think could I you ask, so, what I feel about the language is that in Sri Lanka, it's very much a class marker. Those who speak English are set apart from those who don't in terms of socio-economic privilege, right? So when we were growing up, there were the customs, the must, like even exposure to literature, to art, those are all part of a certain westernized lifestyle. And I think that those of us, or the children especially, who don't grow up in that environment, I think probably they feel, and I used to feel, very insecure in company that obviously was westernized and knowledgeable about such things. And I believe it is so even now, that I've that even now the whole, the ability to speak English becomes like determines your career, your future, especially if you're a professional.
Right. So right now, when you were writing the book, you were many years later from when the incidents actually took place, and you were outside of the community. So that's kind of at some point I read that you mentioned that it was also a plus point for you to write from a distance, to see things in a more objective manner. But at the same time, you're also drawing from your personal experiences. So how did the community react to this kind of narration that you brought in your book?
So for the most part, I think it has been positive in that the community saw itself portrayed, because I don't think there's very many books. I know Amina Hussein writes, but other than that, and especially my generation, I'm older than, I think people liked seeing a history that had recaptured and presented. But I also had some pushback about whether I was being respectful in portraying, especially my father, the history and what happened. And that's a question I don't dismiss, because I think that's something I should take into account, because I appreciate loyalty and duty, and but I also felt that if I didn't write a book that was authentic, if I presented my parents and anybody else as these perfect human beings, who would want to read the book? Because it would be so blatantly, idealized and untrue. So I hope I try to strike a balance by being truthful, but also being loving, so that I presented a human being who had his strengths and weaknesses, just like I did, like all of us, but who I think whose generosity and love was also very evident. But I did experience pushback in that sense, because we are not a transparent community. We are not a transparent culture.
Right. I think we come back to that point about keeping it authentic, how far you do it, especially when you're representing a community, or even in the case of Carmel, representing a profession. I think I'll keep that quest thought for at the end of the panel. And thank you, Yasmin. Thank you for your reading.
Thank you very much.
And I would like to now invite Dr. Neshantha Harischandra. Neshantha is the author of A House Down Queer Street. So from Golf Fort, we are moving in terms of geographical locations. We are not moving very far. We're still in the down south, but we are moving into a completely different community, a completely different background, which Neshantha portrays in A House Down Queer Street. It's a story that traces the life of a band born and bred in a traditional south of Sri Lanka. And it brings to life the social differences as well as the struggles within a family, and which is trying to kind of uphold certain levels in terms of class. And it also has a kind of a bit of mystery mingled into the narrative, which I thought like was a really interesting narrative plot that Neshantha had used there. So Neshantha, it's over to you to do your reading, and then we'll discuss about your book.
This is from chapter 2. The rituals would start with Amma's preparations of kaung, cookies, and aggala. What she could ill afford for herself and me, to be taken to Asiripaya for the Sinhala New Year. Then the new clothes, sometimes for herself also, but always for me. Even as a child, I could sense that the clothes had more to do with the importance of the visit than the Aurudda itself. For though tradition demanded that we wear new clothes on the auspicious day, at the auspicious time, in the auspicious color, I would be wearing mine a few days ahead. And then the long bus journey from Dikwella to Bogaslanda. On the way, Amma would reiterate her advice on my conduct at Asiripaya. Be polite to your cousins. Always call them Nangi, Matilda Nangi and Natalie Nangi, even if they don't call you Ayya. And when Stella Nanda offers you cake, she would say solemnly, take a piece and say, thank you. When she offers another, politely say, no, thank you. Do you understand? Yes, Amma, I would reply, dutifully at first. Half an hour later, she would talk again, as if suddenly remembering something important. Stella Nanda makes nice cakes. Don't take more than one piece. She might offer you a second piece just to be polite, but don't take it. Yes, Amma, I would say again, this time a little less patiently. An hour or so later, Amma would become talkative again. Matilda Nangi and Natalie Nangi are not used to the kind of games you play. They might ask you to play with them. Not that they will for sure, but sometimes they might. If they do, play what they ask you to and don't suggest anything of your own, even if you don't like their game. Girls usually play with dolls. And Stella Nanda, yes, Amma, I won't eat any of her cake, all right? Not 2 pieces, not 1. Our Aurudu visiting had a routine. Nearing our destination, I would put aside whatever book I was engrossed in and be on the lookout for the enormous bo tree, which was one of the few remaining of the species that, a long time ago, used to be abundant in Amma's village, or so I had heard, and start preparing to get down at the sight of it. The bus would stop in front of Karolis Mudalali's tea kiosk, and we would have to first cross the main road and then the railway line, at which juncture Amma would invariably clutch my hand in a warning gesture, as if she expected a train to come and run us down any moment. Once on the other side, the signboard to the right would proclaim that we had managed to reach Bogaslanda safe. And so we would walk on, past Iskola Gedara, then a number of other houses, then the village temple, and the village school on the opposite side, and another array of houses with a boutique or two in between, till we came to a T-junction and the next signboard, Queer Street. When I was at that age, when reading English words in public name boards was considered an achievement, I once asked Amma what queer meant and how it was pronounced. She replied that queer was no word at all and that the correct word had been queen, renamed from something she could not recall to commemorate the British monarch's visit. At some stage, the latter half of the N had come off and no one had bothered to repaint it. But why, I asked? It was unimaginable that a signboard in honor of such a great personage, the lovely lady on horseback under the heading Ape Regina in our primer, should be thus neglected. Why should they, Amma reasoned? Everyone knows this is Queen Street. But did she really come here, Amma? I was curious to know. If she means Queen Elizabeth II, and here means this country, then yes, Amma replied. And I was familiar enough with her tone not to probe further. Already, the snaking white boundary wall of Asiripaya was visible, and a few minutes later, we would be at the wrought iron double gates. Thank you.
Thank you, Neshantha. So the traditional Sinhala southern village, like its rituals, its lifestyles, and most importantly, the social tensions. That's what comes in this particular novel of yours. What helped you base these factors into your writing? What's the background or the story behind the story?
Well, the story, I'm trying not to give too much away, is basically about this boy, Asiri. His father dies even before he was born, and his mother dies when he's in the second year of his of medical college, and he comes to live with his uncle, which is rather not very pleasant, because it's this uncle who has chased away the mother when she married what he considered to be an unsuitable man. Now, this episode is taken during Asiri's childhood, where, like, although the brother has disowned the sister makes it a point to visit the brother every Sinhala New Year. But Asiri, as a boy, he is very uncomfortable because he realizes that they are kind of outsiders, and he feels how ostracized they are, not only by the uncle, but by the villagers in general, and especially what in those days used to be referred as servants. There were a number of servants in this house. So this has a strong impact on what he becomes later on in life.
So a bit like taking that question a bit forward, for you personally, what's the kind of background that made you bring in this particular community into life in your writing?
Because actually this is this is my very first novel, and as is usual with very first novels, people get very personal. Now, this plot, I don't think I knew anybody, I had created anybody in my mind called Asiri, etc., etc. But our village, because my mother and father came from the same village, and when we used to visit the village once every year for the Sinhala New Year, uh, it was kind of, this village kind of grew on me. Maybe because I was not part of the village, I was only a kind of visitor, which meant that I was an outsider. And it was at this stage that I got this ambition. I would have been 8, 9, 10 at that time. I had got this ambition of someday becoming a writer. And I knew even at that stage that the first book that I would be writing, of course, at that time, I assumed that I would be writing my first book in Sinhala. Apart from that difference, everything else was what I had imagined as an 8-year-old. I would be writing. Number one, I wanted to write about the village. And of course, my village name is not Bogaslanda. For political reasons, I changed the name. And this child, I think part of me, although this is the narrator is male, or I feel that a lot of myself has gone into him, because most of the experience that I have, not experience, I mean, they were not experiences that I had, but I could relate to his experiences because I was having similar experiences, being the outsider. Because even among relatives, there were instances where I constantly felt that I was the outsider. So that kind of background was there. When I was 8 years old, I don't think I thought I would ever make my narrator a male. And when I was 8-year-old, I wasn't quite aware of the fact that I was kind of the outside. It only came later on. But anyway, the plot and the characters had a lot to do with my childhood.
Okay, just one more point I would like to raise before we move to our next writer. You locate this story in a certain time period in Sri
Yes.
Lanka.
Yes.
So what was the reason behind this choice?
Because actually when Asiri's childhood tallied with mine, because when he was, when he was 5, 6, 7, 8, I was also, that was the age where we used to visit my village. So it was very natural. And in fact, some people who read the book, they asked me how asked me how I did so much research to get everything correct. For instance, one person said, "How did you know that girls during that era used to wear binko slippers?" But for me, that was very natural because I used to wear binko slippers when I was a child, and that is something that Asiri's cousin wears. So I didn't have to do much research because I lived, it was my childhood that I was speaking about. So it was, number one, it was easy because I didn't have to do any extra research on that time period. It was always there for me. And because it was something that kind of intrigued me, that part of my life.
All right. Thank you, Neshantha. We get
And
back
thank you
to
so much.
yes, we'll get back to both you and Yasmin, time permits for other questions as well. So we'll move on to a third panelist. It's a pleasure to have Carmel Miranda, the author of Crossmatch, a debut novel of fiction which was shortlisted for the Gresham Prize this year. So Carmel is an avid reader and she has had education at the University of Colombo and training in medicine, something which features very strongly in your book. So without further ado, I think we'll hand over to Carmel to do her reading and then catch up with the discussion.
Thank you, Tinaz, for that introduction. Can you hear me? You can, okay. So I'll start with reading a section of the book, which it's taken a little early on in the book, and just a little bit about the background. The protagonist is a medical student, and this happens just as she's confronted with the death of a patient, sort of an unexpected death. And these are some what I'm going to read are some of the thoughts that goes through her head when she's confronted with this death. Okay, so it's basically sort of a monologue. There's no dialogue. So I'll start now. I've seen dead bodies before, of course, lots of them. On the busy, congested wards of a government hospital, death is commonplace. In the overcrowded medical block, for instance, at least half a dozen deaths occur daily, mostly those of elderly people who are brought to hospital in extremis. Instead of being allowed to end their lives peacefully at home, they are rushed to hospital by well-meaning, panic-stricken relatives at the 11th hour and are subjected to all manner of medical torture as doctors and students perform resuscitation techniques in last-ditch efforts to revive them before finally giving up. Deaths on surgical wards are less common, but I have seen a few. The memory of the last one I witnessed is still etched vividly in my mind, that of a tragic burn victim, a 35-year-old woman who had set herself alight after pouring kerosene over her body. The burns unit had been full that day, and she had been admitted to the trauma ward instead. Not that the burn specialist could have helped her much anyway. With more than 80% of her body covered in burns, she had almost no hope of surviving. My skin still crawls when I recall her pitiful screams and the horribly disfigured skin, blackened and blistered in some parts and pink and raw in others. And of course, the acrid smell of kerosene that hung around her like a cloud. One day, she had torn all tubes and dressings from her body and staggered out of bed, moaning and wandering around the ward like a doomed soul, until she was captured and led back to her bed. The end, when it came 2 days later, was a merciful release, and the generous doses of morphine administered to her only subdued her fitfully. I never found out what drove her to do what she did. And then there were those dead bodies I faced in the dissecting rooms of the anatomy block. Dissection of a human body is a rite of passage for new medical students. On the very first day of medical school, I had faced a room full of naked dead bodies laid out on rows of cold dissecting slabs. My senses had been overwhelmed by that sight and the unpleasant smell, a pungent, rancid, oily odor, the smell of human flesh pickled in formaldehyde. That day marked the first step of the change from being a normal teenager to someone who would never look at a human body the same way again. A group of us students, a body group, gathered round each body, laughing and joking to hide our discomfiture. We began dissecting, tentative stabs at first, but soon, confident sweeping cuts deep into the flesh. We started with the upper limb that day, teasing out nerves, ligaments, muscles, and tendons. Over the next few months, we moved on to the abdomen and pelvis, chest, lower limb, and finally the head, neck, and brain. Heart, lungs, kidneys, and liver were plucked out and studied, till all that was left was a hollow torso. By the end of the course, we were intimately associated with the body, or what was left of it. But this is different. The dead bodies on the slabs weren't even called that. We referred to them as cadavers. Only at the first unnerving encounter did they even bear any resemblance to a human form. And the moribund old patients who ended their lives on the medical wards too were anonymous, nothing more than mannequins to be used by us to hone our medical skills. And they had all been older and they had lived their lives. They had probably married, had children, grandchildren, traveled the country and maybe the world too. But this is the first time I've seen the dead body of such a young person, someone around my age who would never have a chance to do any of these things. I'd never known this boy, but when I look down at his lifeless body, a mix of emotion sweeps through me. Pity, sadness, anger. Pity for the boy, sadness for his family, and anger that he had ended up here like this. I wonder what events had led to the accident. Had it been carelessness on his part, or had the driver of the vehicle been at fault? I picture his mother, Leela's sister, receiving the news of her son's death. Would she react like the woman I had seen outside, sobbing silently? Or would she beat her breast and howl and wail like a banshee? Did he have brothers and sisters who would mourn for him? That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Carmel. Thank you for your reading. So you write also from within your experience, you draw out a lot from your experience, from your profession. How did this either help, how did this either challenge you or help your writing of Crossmatch?
Well, I think the fact that I only started to write a few years ago, quite late in life, you can blame that on medicine to start with. But once I started to write, I actually found it was a help because I had a rich source of material to write about. And when I started to write, about medical things, I found that it flowed very easily and came naturally to me. So that's why I decided to base this book around medicine. And I've noticed that there's a lot of curiosity from non-medical people about what goes on behind the scenes in medicine. And especially when I was studying medicine, I used to be asked very often, what was it like when, you saw your first operation, your first, delivery, things like that. So there is a bit of curiosity, and I exploited that curiosity because I related the story from the point of view of a medical student who's seeing some of these things for the first time. And a lot of these first impressions have very profound effects on young students. But what happens normally is that when you keep seeing these things again and again, you get desensitized. And a very common, you get some kind of defense mechanisms to cope with seeing these traumatic things again and again. And a very common thing that doctors do is they joke about these things. So if you ask, an older doctor about these early experiences, there would always be a funny story or something which they would make out of it, because this is one of the ways of coping with these things. But I wanted to show, medicine before this.
Yes, there's a bit of interruption, Carmel, but then I think...
yeah, I think you're back now, no?
Yes.
Okay.
So another thing is this is your first novel.
Yeah.
And but the plot and its twist is quite, I personally felt it was like a real page turner for me. So how did you approach writing a novel, putting together a novel for the first time? So, and also looking at it from a more medical mystery sort of a genre. How did you approach writing this? Did you kind of map out the plot first, or did things just start coming in, and did you just let it take its own course as you wrote?
Well, regarding the genre, medical fiction or medical mystery, that's not a very common genre among Sri Lankan writers, I think. But it's quite a well-established genre outside of Sri Lankan fiction, and a very popular one at that. And I am quite a fan of it myself, and I've noticed that in medical fiction, very often doctors and medical situations are portrayed quite unrealistically. And I felt that with my background knowledge, I could do an authentic job of portraying, what goes on in the medical world. And with regarding to the plot, with regards to the plot, I had a plot in mind when I started, but it's not the one that I finished up with. So what happens is when you start writing, you realize, this doesn't work, or this thing is unlikely to happen, and you change things. So I changed quite a lot of things as I went along. But the ending of the story, which I'm a fan of the, that killer ending or a memorable ending. I love books which have sort of an unforgettable ending, and I was trying to give this book also a good ending. So the ending I had in mind, before I finished the book, and I actually wrote the ending way before I finished the book, and I had to then go back and fill in the other bits.
Yeah, so you also kind of brought up one point which Yasmin as well brought up at the latter part of her session about keeping it authentic. So this is something I think we can look at in terms of all three of yours. As opposed to Yasmin and Neshantha, you are representing a profession in your story. So how much of, keeping it authentic, because Yasmin told us about, how there was a bit of comments about her portrayal of her father. But still, I mean, she wanted to keep it authentic, but she also brought in the positives of it. In your terms, when you are representing the medical profession, what sort of feedback have you got, and where did you have to kind of draw the line in between keeping it authentic and
Well, the thing is, the book is fiction, so it's entirely made up. But I have drawn a lot from real situations and people and events, but I haven't portrayed real people, unlike in Yasmin's book. Everybody is fictionalized, but I may have used characters and certain types of people I have come across in building up my characters. But I'm confident that everything is very representative of the real situation. And lots of doctors who've read the book have told me, my gosh, that's exactly what I felt when I went through this situation and all. So I feel that I have portrayed it quite authentically, but of course it's fiction. It's totally fictionalized.
Neshantha, how about you? Since you again, in a kind of comparison, you're also representing a community like Yasmin does, the traditional Sinhala South, the village. So in terms of keeping the narrative authentic, when you're talking about personal experience and trying to blend that with your plot, your story, how far has that worked in your writing?
Yes. As I was saying, I too came across a lot of criticism. Criticism actually at the manuscript stage, because some of my relatives read it. And one of my aunts, she was very, very unhappy about the fact that I had, again, I tried to talk about this without giving away the plot. There was a small incident where I had mentioned that some people had used a Vesak mask to keep away monkeys from invading the premises. So she made it a point to call me and say, please remove that, because that is a slur on Buddhism. To say that people use this Buddhist this Vesak mask to chase away, to keep away monkeys from coming. So actually, I was a little stubborn. I did not remove that incident, because I felt, now what has a Vesak mask got to do with Buddhism? That was my question, which I didn't have the guts to tell her. I just said, okay, thank you for pointing that out, and I was quiet, but I did not change it. So there were a lot of things, and even my sister who read the book, she also said that I don't know how this is going to be received if it's published. I don't know how this is going to be received by the community, because she said that you have really, hacked the villagers, which I think that was a little going too far, because all I did was try to, as Miss Azad was saying, just to try to portray a community that I knew once upon a time, and unfortunately that kind of community is not there anymore, because today when I visit my village, the people are very different. So so it was a kind of community that you used to be there a number of decades ago, and there are some things that when seen from the eyes of a person in the 21st century, they might think that it is criticism, but it is not. It is the way people were, and I have tried to mute whatever negative aspects there were as much as possible. But again, I can't be giving a rosy picture of village life as it was, because people think, especially people who haven't been in villages, especially the young generation, when you say village, you think that it is utopia and with all the innocent people. Villages are associated with innocence. So that kind of thing is really not there, because that was not how I, even as a child, because the first part of the story is actually, although I didn't do it deliberately, it's seen through the eyes of a child. So even as a child, I was aware that there were certain things in this village I really, really loved, which was not quite correct. But now both my sister, and she's also from the same village as is my aunt, they were not very happy about the portrayal of the village, because they thought that I was being overcritical.
Right. Thank you so much. Neshantha, there is one question directed to you. It's more of the regarding the language
Right.
that you use in your writing. So the question goes, in an age of globalization where English is more immediate and present more than ever, why is there the use of many colloquial idioms in your writing? Like, does it kind of give an outdated style to you? Have you done it like intentionally, or why is it?
And not intentionally, because I actually, the glossary is 16 pages, if anybody has noticed it. I realized that there were a lot of Sinhala words, but this came naturally, because for me, if it's cookies or agala, I just like, if I say oil cake, it doesn't give the same ring. And when we are talking about mother, for me, it's natural that you talk about, say, Amma and, Stella Nanda, aunt, rather than saying Aunt Stella. To me, Stella Nanda was natural. Until I had a problem with my publishers, because actually I had to confess, this went through a number of publishers. So I think this was the 5th publisher who ultimately bore with me and got it, saw through the publication. They didn't like this word. It was very difficult for them to make these words with this A and the E together. They were asking me, where other people don't spell it like that, why do you want? But anyway, that's the way I wrote it. And well, I realized that, in fact, I was kind of prepared for kind of criticism, but for me, I didn't do it deliberately. Just to give a Sri Lankanness to the story, it came naturally. It's just that I didn't, I was not very, and at the stage I started writing, this is the latter part of my life. If I had written this story 20 or 30 years ago, I would have been kind of conscious about what other people would think, to being politically correct. But at the time I wrote it, I think I had kind of changed a lot. And I was not all that interested in, being what is called politically correct. What I felt was natural, I wrote.
Okay. We have one question to all the 3 writers. So I think y'all can take the take it one after the other. Maybe we could start with Yasmin. Yasmin, I know you have replied to it as well on the chat, but just to voice it out loud. Who are the writers who influenced you at your formative stages, or at least the kind of writing you looked up to? Yasmin, who are the writers?
So primarily George Eliot, because she never demonizes characters. You know, she writes with compassion even for the villains. And that's something that I try to do in my own writing, try to make no bad people or good people, just human beings struggling with life like everybody else.
All right. Carmel, how about you? And especially in terms of the genre that you've written.
That's a difficult question. There are so many. I mean, I read a lot of fiction, both mystery and non-mystery. But if you're specifically talking about mysteries, there are two types of authors, like Agatha Christie and Arthur Conan Doyle. I mean, they had amazing imaginations and they concoct the most unbelievable, amazing plots, and there's a lot to learn from them. But I'm more a fan of writers that go beyond the plot. So in addition to a good mystery, I'm a fan of writers who give you the backstory and tell you more about the characters, about what they're feeling, the background of the story, the location of the story, other issues related to the story, and specifically writers like Elizabeth George, P.D. James, Colin Dexter. He wrote the Inspector Morse. They wrote a lot around the story. So you learned a lot, more than just who done it. There's a lot more you could pick up from those books. And one of my favorites, of course, is Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier, who I think is a perfect combination of the mystery, the atmosphere, the characters, and then, as that killer ending, the twist at the end. With the particularly this genre, medical fiction, there are a few, maybe not that well known here. There's an author called Kathy Reichs who writes. She's a medical person as well. She writes medical fiction, sort of thrillers from a medical point of view. And there's a few others like that. But there's too many to mention. I mean, no author or writer that I look up to.
Right. Thank you, Carmel. Neshantha, who would you name as writers who influenced you at your formative stages?
Yes, now this is rather a tricky question because I will be partly answering the question, but partly the answer will be a little contradictory because whoever's book I read, I do get influenced. But if I am to attribute one person, it's Enid Blyton, because now, according to the question, who influenced you at your formative stages, because it was during my time, girls went through what was called an Enid Blyton phase. I mean, to be more politically correct, people who like reading English books. So that was a standard phase that girls used to go through. And it was during this phase that I got this burning ambition to become a writer someday. And that was directly because through Enid Blyton, because I was like, the first book I ever read outside the school curriculum was Naughty Amelia Jane. And that is where I started my ambition. And then I was very thrilled to know that there were more books by this particular writer. And I spent my childhood looking for these books and reading them. And it is through her that I got to know about E. Nesbit and Carrie's War, everything, and later on Dickens, Hardy, Jane Austen, and then the Pansiya Panas Jataka and the Mahabharata, which I'm still reading. And whatever people say about her writing, And whatever I may think about her as an adult, I can't forget the fact that it was Enid Blyton who opened to me this world of literature, and that is one of the most precious things in my life. And it is to her that I owe everything. And also, I think I should say at this stage, it's very sad that today her books have been taken off the shelves, because I mean, it's a pity. Whatever, I mean, however politically correct people want to be, there are a lot of things that children, a lot of positive things that children can learn from her book. So just because she belonged to a particular age and she was representative of that age, I don't think it's fair to look down her or ban her books. Yeah.
Right. Thank you. I think that brings us to, yes, we've completed the hour that is assigned to us. So on behalf of New Ink, thank you, Yasmin, Carmel, and Neshantha for agreeing to join this panel. And it was really interesting, and your writing, I personally enjoyed all three books. So thank you once again, and thank you to all the participants who took a Saturday morning off to join us here. So this brings us to an end of the second day of New Ink. We will be having a final session tomorrow, again from 10 a.m. to 12 noon.